motion absolute law. When we begin to see this, we begin to see that we are escaping from most of the type of thinking that wrecked antiquity. We are moving forward into something, and we do not know how it was concealed as long as it was, but that it appeared spontaneously in many areas, and that it is intimated by men like Pythagoras and Plato, who were initiates, to have existed, intimated by Apuleius and Plutarch, to have existed, referred to arcanely by Cicero and Seneca, known to the Emperor Julian as the result of his own initiation at Ephesus, and appearing again in the apocalyptical writings of the New Testament. These factors, breaking through, seem to tell us, beyond any reasonable doubt, that this structure of the Corpus Hermeticum was the beginning of, or one of the beginnings, of the effort to build a complete scientific philosophical foundation under the collapsing religions of antiquity. That this information had been previously perfected, and that the outstanding examples of this perfection would be found in the great architectural and legal documents of antiquity, such as the Code of Hammurabi, probably the earliest and one of the most enlightened of all legal codes. That it is to be found concealed in various ways in the proportions and dimensions of ancient buildings, that it roots in mathematics, that it roots in subjects so ancient that we cannot even trace their beginnings, that there was also a consistent, integrated concept of the solar system, of the universe, of space, of time, of energy, and all of these things, which certainly form no part of the decadent ceremonials of the old, later Roman priesthood, whose principal concerns were to be sure that they had the right cap on and that they were wearing the red slippers without which they could not perform their sacred duties. And when asked why they wore the red slippers, the answer seemed to be because their forefathers had sacrificed animals and stood with their feet in the blood. These things became a kind of orthodoxy, but behind it all was this other, greater thing. And when Julius Caesar sacrificed to the gods as emperor deity, he certainly did not know these other things, or he would not have conducted his life in the way that he did. So this double body of learning came out, and we find it striking in Syria through the Syrian Gnosis, and in Alexandria through the Alexandrian Gnosis, through the Corpus Hermeticum, through the Neoplatonists, and through the rise of Christianity and the impact of Essenian and Therapeutae thinking in North Africa. All of this body of material arising almost at the same time, all with the same basic dimension of released thinking, and also, for the first time, polarized thinking. You'll remember that when medicine was still in the sanctuary and was serviced by priest physicians, that there were no legislations in Rome for the deportment of a doctor. The moment, however, medicine left the temple and physicians became secular, it was necessary within 10 years to create one of the most elaborate legal systems in the world to prevent medical malpractice. The moment the sacredness of the thing was removed, the moment there was the secular physician, there was the need for medical reform, almost within the day. The same thing happened in this intellectual field. The moment the knowledge of the power, potential, and possibility of the human mind was equipped with the instruments of knowledge, instruments which Cicero and Seneca also mention, immediately it was necessary to create legislation, real or theoretical, to prevent the abuse of knowledge. And from that time on today, we are still trying to find out how to prevent that abuse, and we have not by any means succeeded. Against this abuse, we have thrown a great moral framework, and today even in our present emergency, we are using religion to combat the destructiveness of materialistic scientific thinking. And by an instinct, without any actual integration, without anyone being able as a person to require it or demand it, the age of atomics has resulted in the greatest age of religious revival the world has had in at least 1,000 years. So back in the first century, the rise of a great scientific concept of life threw immediately into perspective the need for this great religious reform. So the scientific phase of it, the philosophical phase of it, and Christianity as the religious phase of it, all came into existence together. Each part of a need, each essential to an orientation. Now, what was the actual wisdom orientation of that time? Were the individuals involved in that revelation actually as wise as some think they were, or as foolish as some others think they were? Can we honestly say today, looking back upon the first century, that those people knew anything that we do not know? I think we can be almost forced to answer in the affirmative that they did. Because actually, in order to exhaust what they knew, we have to exhaust something which we have not yet exhausted. And that is the instrument by means of which we are capable of creative knowing. It is one thing to copy the past, which we have done. It is one thing to take a Roman sewer pipe and make a better one today. It is one thing to take an Egyptian lute and make a more perfect instrument of it. It is one thing to take a Syrian trumpet and make a peculiar hook in it or twist it and form it into what we call a trombone. That is all within the possibility of things. Actually, our French horn has not changed much in the last 2,000 years. It is quite possible to take a piece of Coptic or Greek fabric and create new ways of weaving it. It is possible to use the Greek mathematical theory and find constant applications for it. But these do not represent the basic point. Sometime, somewhere, someone created geometry. This creation consisted not of bringing something out of nothing, but of a peculiar type of trained intuitive observationalism by means of which a human being suddenly recognized the universe as a geometric manifestation of universal energy. This individual had the power to see geometry in nature, or sense it, or begin to organize it. Somebody else saw for the first time the analogies between music and number. Another individual saw somewhere, somehow, the basic principle of chemistry and the chemical combinations of elements. Somewhere there were basic thoughts. The basic thought of the 47th proposition of Pythagoras, or the Euclidean proposition. Study your ancient contributions in astronomy, geometry, music, rhetoric, grammar. Somewhere these things had perhaps not a fully developed emergence, but a series of creative impulses by which that appeared which was not previously available. We have not exhausted antiquity until we have reached a point where we can create knowledge rather than merely extend existing knowledge. When the individual of today can create something as absolutely independent as arithmetic, he may then say that he has a creative power to exhaust, and has exhausted, the previous contributions of his people. But as long as he merely uses arithmetic, he has lacked that tremendous creativity which is the basis of the wisdom of antiquity, the power to be the first to know something. Now, we may say that everything worth knowing has already been found, so we can't do it. This is untrue. There are more firsts waiting than have ever yet been revealed. But as long as we are content to use rather than to create, we have lost one dimension of thinking. And that dimension is the very thing that the Hermetic doctrine is concerned with, namely man's ability to become conscious within and of the universal mind itself, so that every individual creates with the mind of God, or with the universal divine intellect. Thus, the end of all knowing, according to the Hermetic system, is that men will not think about God or think of God, but think with God. And this statement still poses one of the most difficult situations with which the average individual can intellectually be confronted, because we cannot even understand fully what this implication actually is. But we do know that at a time less blessed than our own, when the opportunities for knowledge were much less than ours, when the instruments of available learning were far more deficient than ours, men had the creativity which established all of our great instruments of knowledge. Therefore, that this creativity lay within consciousness itself, was not acquired but was innate, and that the solution to all things lies in the innate solutional power of the universal mind in man. Now, that someone 2,000 years ago should have sounded this is important, and it is easy to see why this idea could not die, why it had to continue to exercise an influence. And it is also possible to estimate from this why this orientation could have been involved in the corpus hermeticum. The idea of this one consciousness, the author of all knowledge, this one mind, the substance of all good, and of course with it all the vision of the way in which man, through the development of the special and particular faculties of his own consciousness, might in some way and in due time attain to identity with this mind. We will learn a little later that such is the burden of the divine Paramanda, or the shepherd of men. And we know that it is the burden of that department of the Neoplatonic thinking which is called the theurgical part, namely theurgy, the magic of fulfillment, the magic of doing, the magic not of listening nor learning, but the strange power to be one with truth. So back even in that day, men dreamed of the possibility of bringing their own consciousness in rapport with the universal consciousness. And the secret books of Hermes and the mysteries of the Hermetic doctrine were in one way or another concealed in this, or were concerned with it. Thus, the moment we apply this key to alchemy, we change the entire perspective of these chemists. The transmutation of ignorance, the transmutation of not knowing into the state of pure enlightenment. The creation of the universal medicine, truth itself, which alone can heal all the sickness of ignorance wherever it is distributed. And the principal primary contribution of the Hermetic philosophy was that such a truth elixir was possible. That it was not the vain speculation of deluded persons. That it was not a hope beyond possibility, but that truth substantially was attainable. Perhaps not immediately, perhaps not totally, but that the motion toward truth, was the motion toward solution of every problem, internal and external, as far as problem could beset man or any of his attributes. Thus, the Hermetic arts consisted of the arts of human regeneration. There is everything to indicate that they were influenced by Buddhism. Buddhism with its noble path of renunciation. It is quite possible that the Hermetic philosophy was influenced by the earlier systems of Eastern mysticism that resulted in Yoga and Vedanta. It is quite possible and almost certain that this system was also influenced by the part of the old Sanhedrin, the great Sanhedrin of the Jews, which dealt with the mystery of the Merkaba, or the chariot of righteousness, by means of which the prophet is transported to heaven without death. This chariot of righteousness, this chariot of Ezekiel, being the symbol of illumination, or the spiritual ecstasy by which man is moved from one world to another. Hermes himself describes this experience, or the writer of the Hermetic doctrine creates a person and causes that person to be the personification of the truth seeker, receiving into himself the experience peculiar to those who through dedication have become worthy of the truth. Thus, in the Pymander and in other Hermetic fragments, universal mind or consciousness becomes the teacher, instructing the disciple in the attainment of the great end of learning, which is the Hermetic marriage, or the Hermetic union, the union of the mortal and the immortal in an indissoluble bond of amity. In these thinkings, then, we have the grounds for many mystical speculations that were to come at later date. We see the source of a large part of Christian mysticism. We begin to see why the more illumined church fathers must have recognized the same essential doctrine that they themselves were seeking to cultivate. They must also have realized that the experience of deity is the end of all spiritual quest. And because Hermeticism, like the early church, was concerned with truth as an experience of consciousness, it could not be rejected totally, any more than the ethical experience of Plato could be rejected totally. So the orientation of our problem is historically in these centuries of change, these centuries by which certain directives arose in the thinking of man, and in the midst of these directives we see the rise of this very strange and elusive belief. A belief, however, which again never died, but became disseminated through 100 sects, even reaching into the Near East to become very important in the teachings of the dervishes and the Sufis. Thus this teaching moved in and on through time, losing its name after a very short time, but never losing its directive to the individual or its positive affirmation of the exact science of human illumination or redemption through the spiritual experience of illumination. These elements and these factors give us the orientation and will, I think, permit us to go on next week with a further analysis of the doctrine itself.